Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded shopping mall with her head held high, but she could feel the stares burning into her back. The elaborate tattoo covering her left arm drew attention wherever she went. Some people whispered behind their hands, others pointed openly, and a few brave souls even asked intrusive questions about why a young woman would ruin her body with such markings. The tattoo wasn't just random art, it was a carefully designed memorial that told a story most people would never understand. The design featured an American flag intertwined with military dog tags, surrounded by dates and names that meant everything to her. At the center was a detailed portrait of a German shepherd in military gear, with kind eyes that seemed to watch over everything else in the design. Sarah had gotten used to the judgment over the past 3 years. People saw a 24-year-old woman with visible tattoos and made assumptions. They assumed she was rebellious, irresponsible, or simply following some trend. What they didn't know was that every line of ink on her arm represented sacrifice, loss, and a bond stronger than most people could imagine. That particular Tuesday started like any other day. Sarah worked at a local veterinary clinic where her colleagues had long since stopped commenting on her tattoo. Dr. Peterson, the clinic owner, had initially been hesitant to hire someone with such visible body art, worried about how clients might react. But Sarah's skill with animals and her gentle nature quickly won everyone over. She had a special way with traumatized animals, particularly dogs who had experienced trauma. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to grab a quick sandwich from the food court. As she stood in line at the deli counter, she noticed a group of teenagers at a nearby table pointing at her and snickering. Their comments weren't particularly quiet, and other customers began to turn and look. "Look at that girl's arm," one of the teens said loudly. "That's so gross. Why would anyone do that to themselves? My mom says people with tattoos like that can't get real jobs," another added, causing the group to burst into laughter. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her eyes forward and tried to ignore them. She had dealt with this kind of reaction countless times before. Usually she could brush it off, but today felt different. Maybe it was because she was tired, or maybe it was because tomorrow marked the 3rd anniversary of the day that changed her life forever. An elderly woman behind her in line leaned forward and whispered, "You shouldn't let them bother you, dear." Though I must say that's quite an extensive tattoo for someone so young. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it stung nonetheless. Sarah simply nodded and moved forward in line, ordering her usual turkey sandwich. As she waited for her order, the teenagers' comments continued, growing bolder as they noticed they had an audience. "I bet she's one of those military wannabes," one of them said. "You know, the type who thinks tattoos make them look tough." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. They had no idea what they were talking about, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a response. She had learned long ago that trying to explain herself to strangers was pointless. How could she possibly make them understand the weight of what she carried? When her sandwich was ready, Sarah found a quiet corner table away from the group. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos, stopping at one that always brought tears to her eyes. It showed her in military fatigues kneeling beside a beautiful German shepherd named Rex. Both of them were smiling in the dusty landscape of Afghanistan, completely unaware of what lay ahead. Rex had been more than just a military working dog. He had been her partner, her protector, and her best friend during 2 tours of duty overseas. As a dog handler in the Army, Sarah had trained with Rex for months before their deployment. They had learned to read each other's signals, to trust each other completely, and to work as a single unit in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. The tattoo on her arm wasn't just artwork. It was Rex's memorial. Every detail had been carefully planned to honor his service and sacrifice. The dates marking his birth and death, the coordinates of the location where he had saved her life, and the Purple Heart symbol recognizing his sacrifice in the line of duty. Sarah remembered the day she had decided to get the tattoo. She had been struggling with survivor's guilt and PTSD after returning home. The traditional therapy wasn't working, and she felt disconnected from everyone around her. The tattoo artist, a veteran himself, had understood immediately when she explained what she wanted. He had worked with her for months, refining the design until it perfectly captured everything she wanted to remember about Rex. As she sat in the food court, picking at her sandwich, Sarah could still hear the occasional snicker from the group of teenagers. Other customers had moved on, But the kids seemed determined to make their opinions known. She wondered what they would think if they knew the truth about her service, about Rex, about the night that earned them both a place in military history. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, being judged by people who had never sacrificed anything for their country. People who slept safely in their beds because others like her and Rex had stood guard in foreign lands. She had learned not to expect gratitude or understanding from civilians, but the casual cruelty still hurt. Sarah finished her sandwich quickly, eager to return to the safety of the veterinary clinic. As she stood to throw away her trash, she noticed the teenagers had gotten louder, now openly mocking other customers as well. Their parents were nowhere to be seen, and the food court staff seemed reluctant to intervene. Walking past their table on her way to the exit, Sarah heard one final comment that stopped her in her tracks. People like that just want attention. Real heroes don't need to advertise it with tattoos. The words hit her like a physical blow. If only they knew that real heroes often came home broken, struggling to find their place in a world that didn't understand what they had been through. If only they knew that sometimes a tattoo was the only way to keep a fallen friend's memory alive. Sarah paused for just a moment, her hand instinctively moving to touch the memorial on her arm. Then she continued walking, her head held high despite the tears threatening to fall. Tomorrow would mark 3 years since Rex had given his life to save hers, and she would honor that sacrifice whether anyone understood it or not. The next morning brought no relief from the memories that haunted Sarah's dreams. She woke before dawn as she had every day since returning from Afghanistan, and went through her carefully established routine. Exercise, shower, coffee, and then the drive to work that took her past the military memorial downtown. She never stopped there anymore, but she always slowed down and whispered Rex's name as she passed. At the veterinary clinic, Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed focus. Dr. Peterson had scheduled her to work with a new patient that morning, a retired police dog named Bruno, who had been struggling with anxiety since his handler's retirement. The German Shepherd mix reminded her painfully of Rex, but she knew her experience could help him adjust to civilian life. Bruno had been pacing in his kennel when Sarah arrived, his ears pinned back and his breathing rapid. The moment she approached, however, something shifted in his demeanor. Dog seemed to sense something different about her, something that put military and working dogs at ease almost immediately. "Hey there, big guy," Sarah said softly, crouching down to Bruno's eye level. "I know this is scary. New place, new people, and your partner isn't here anymore." Bruno's ears perked up slightly and he moved closer to the kennel door. Sarah slowly extended her hand, letting him catch her scent. Within minutes, the anxious dog had calmed considerably, eventually lying down near the door where he could keep watching her. Dr. Peterson observed from a distance, amazed as always by Sarah's natural ability with traumatized animals. He had hired her despite his initial reservations about her appearance, and it had proven to be one of the best decisions he had ever made. Sarah understood animal trauma in ways that textbooks couldn't teach, because she had lived through trauma herself. Around mid-morning, the clinic's front desk receptionist, Maria, came back to find Sarah. "There's someone here asking specifically for you," she said with a puzzled expression. "Says he heard about your work with military dogs from someone at the VA hospital." Sarah looked up from Bruno's kennel, curious. Word had been spreading through the veteran community about her success helping former military and police dogs adjust to retirement. She had been doing it informally for months, using techniques she had learned during her own recovery process. In the clinic's front lobby stood a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap with Navy insignia. His posture immediately marked him as military, even in civilian clothes. Beside him sat a beautiful Belgian Malinois who was clearly alert, but struggling with some kind of behavioral issue. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, retired Navy. This is Ace." He gestured to the dog at his side. "I heard from some folks at the VA that you might be able to help us." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that marked him as an officer. "What kind of help are you looking for, Commander?" "Ace here just retired after 8 years of service. He's having a hard time adjusting to civilian life, and honestly, so am I. The VA therapist suggested that working with someone who understands both sides of the equation might help." As Commander Morrison explained Ace's symptoms, hypervigilance, Difficulty relaxing, aggressive reactions to unexpected noises. Sarah recognized every sign. She had seen them in other retired military dogs, and she had experienced many of them herself. "I'd be happy to work with both of you," Sarah said, kneeling down to let Ace sniff her hand. The dog's response was immediate and positive, his tail wagging slightly for the first time since entering the clinic. As they discussed Ace's history and training background, Commander Morrison's eyes kept drifting to Sarah's tattoo. Unlike the judgment she usually faced, his expression showed something closer to recognition and respect. "That's beautiful work," he said finally, nodding toward her arm. "Military memorial?" Sarah felt her guard go up slightly. Even veterans sometimes questioned her right to honor Rex in such a permanent way. "Yes, sir. For my partner Rex, we served 2 tours together in Afghanistan." "Dog handler?" Morrison asked, and when Sarah nodded, his expression grew more interested. "What unit?" 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. Rex was a dual-purpose dog, explosives detection and patrol. Commander Morrison's demeanor shifted noticeably. "The 173rd did some incredible work over there. I was Navy, but we worked with you folks on several joint operations." "When did you serve?" As Sarah shared some of her deployment history, carefully avoiding the classified details, she watched Morrison's respect deepen. Here was someone who understood the weight of what she had carried, both overseas and in coming home. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another client, Mrs. Henderson, who brought her elderly cat in for regular checkups. As Sarah excused herself to help with the appointment, she heard Mrs. Henderson make a comment to Morrison about young people these days and their tattoos. Morrison's response was quiet but firm. "Ma'am, that young woman is a war veteran who served her country with honor. That tattoo is a memorial to her fallen partner. I'd ask that you show her the respect she's earned." Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed and quickly changed the subject, but Sarah had heard every word. It was the first time in months that someone had stood up for her in public, and it meant more than Commander Morrison could possibly know. When Sarah returned from the appointment, Morrison was still there with Ace, who had settled down considerably in the welcoming environment of the clinic. "I'd like to set up regular sessions," Morrison said, "and if you don't mind me asking, would you be willing to share some of your techniques with other handlers? There's a whole network of us struggling with the same issues." The idea intrigued Sarah. She had been helping individual dogs and their handlers informally, but the thought of reaching more veterans appealed to her. "I'd be open to that. Maybe we could start with a small group?" "I think that would be incredible," Morrison said. "There's actually a military reunion coming up next weekend. A lot of different branches will be represented, including some SEAL teams that worked with Army dog handlers overseas. Would you consider coming as our guest?" Sarah hesitated. Large groups of military personnel could be overwhelming, especially when they included active duty members who might question her service or her methods. But the opportunity to help more veterans like Morrison and Ace was too important to pass up. "I'll think about it," she said finally. As Morrison and Ace prepared to leave, the commander paused at the door. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you're doing here matters. A lot of us are struggling with the transition, and having someone who understands both sides of it, well, it's exactly what we need." After they left, Sarah found herself thinking about Morrison's invitation. Part of her was terrified at the thought of facing a room full of military personnel, but another part was excited about the possibility of expanding her informal therapy work into something more organized. She looked down at Rex's portrait on her arm and whispered, "What do you think, boy? Ready to help some more of your fellow warriors?" That evening, Sarah called Morrison and accepted his invitation to the reunion. She had no idea that this decision would lead to the most challenging and ultimately transformative experience of her post-military life. The military reunion was being held at the American Legion Hall downtown, a modest building that had hosted countless gatherings of veterans over the decades. Sarah arrived early, hoping to get oriented before the crowd grew too large. She had spent considerable time choosing what to wear, finally settling on a simple blue dress that covered most of her tattoo, while still allowing Rex's portrait to be visible on her forearm. Commander Morrison met her at the entrance, looking more relaxed than he had at the clinic. "Sarah, I'm so glad you decided to come. There are some people I'd really like you to meet." As they entered the hall, Sarah was struck by the easy camaraderie among the veterans. Different branches of service were represented, from fresh-faced recent discharges to grizzled retirees who had served in conflicts spanning decades. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, but Sarah still felt like an outsider looking in. Morrison guided her toward a group of men and women clustered around a table near the back of the room. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, the veteran I was telling you about. She's doing incredible work helping retired military dogs and their handlers." The introductions began immediately. There was Staff Sergeant Williams from the Marines, who had worked with bomb-sniffing dogs in Iraq. Captain Davis from the Air Force had handled security dogs at bases across Europe. Each person Sarah met had their own story of partnership with military working dogs, and each seemed genuinely interested in her approach to helping them transition to civilian life. "Morrison tells us you've got some innovative techniques," said Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a weathered Navy veteran with kind eyes. "We've got a lot of guys struggling with their retired partners. Traditional therapy isn't always hitting the mark." Sarah found herself relaxing as she shared some of her methods. These people understood the unique bond between handlers and their dogs in ways that civilian therapists simply couldn't. They nodded knowingly when she described the guilt many handlers felt about their dogs, post-service struggles, and they asked thoughtful questions about adapting military training, techniques for civilian life. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of what Morrison quietly identified as a group of active duty SEALs. Even in civilian clothes, they were unmistakable. Their bearing, their confidence, and their tendency to move as a coordinated unit marked them clearly as elite operators. Sarah noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere as the SEALs joined the gathering. There was obvious respect for their service, but also a certain tension that often existed between different military communities. Special operations forces sometimes looked down on conventional units, and Sarah had experienced this attitude during her deployments. The SEAL team's leader, a man in his 30s with the kind of intense stare that came from years of high-stakes operations, glanced around the group with practiced assessment. His eyes stopped on Sarah, taking in her appearance with obvious skepticism. "So you're the dog expert Morrison's been talking about," he said, his tone neutral but somehow dismissive. Interesting approach to memorial tattoos. Sarah felt the familiar burn of judgment, but this time it stung more because it came from a fellow service member. "It's a memorial for my partner Rex. We served together in Afghanistan." "Right," the SEAL said, clearly unimpressed. "Support staff, I assume? Important work keeping the camp secure." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt several of the other veterans tense up around her. Morrison looked like he was about to intervene, but Sarah held up a slight hand to stop him. "Actually, we worked outside the wire quite a bit," Sarah said calmly. "Explosive detection, route clearance, patrol support. Rex and I spent most of our deployment time in forward operating positions." The SEAL's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a flicker of something, perhaps surprise that she had pushed back instead of backing down. "That's commendable," he said finally, the word carrying just enough pause to suggest he found her claims questionable. The conversation moved on, but Sarah noticed that the SEAL, who had introduced himself only as Commander Thompson, kept watching her throughout the evening. His scrutiny was different from the casual judgment she usually faced. This felt more like an evaluation, as if he was trying to determine whether she belonged in this company of warriors. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself sharing more detailed stories about her deployment experiences. She described the complexity of working with Rex in urban environments, the challenges of detecting IEDs in Afghanistan's difficult terrain, and the constant pressure of knowing that one missed signal could cost lives. "The hardest part wasn't the danger," she explained to a group that had gathered around her table. "It was the responsibility. Rex depended on me to read the environment correctly, and my unit depended on both of us to keep them safe. Every decision carried weight." Master Chief Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That's something civilians don't understand about military service. It's not just about personal courage, it's about carrying the weight of other people's lives." Sarah was surprised to see Commander Thompson listening intently from a nearby table. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, but his expression remained unreadable. The evening took an unexpected turn when someone suggested that Sarah share the story behind her tattoo. She hesitated, knowing that telling Rex's story meant revealing some of her most painful memories. But the group was so supportive that she found herself agreeing. "Rex saved my life on our final patrol," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "We were conducting route clearance in Helmand Province when we encountered a complex ambush. Rex detected an IED that would have taken out our entire patrol, but the enemy had positioned it as part of a larger trap." She described how Rex had alerted to the explosive device, how the patrol had moved to neutralize the threat, and how they had found themselves pinned down by enemy fire from multiple positions. The firefight had lasted for hours, with Rex working alongside the soldiers to provide security and detect additional threats. "Rex was shot while protecting our position," Sarah continued, her hand unconsciously moving to touch his portrait on her arm. "He could have retreated to safety, but he stayed between the enemy and our wounded. He gave us the time we needed for air support to arrive." The room had grown quiet as Sarah spoke. Even Commander Thompson had stopped pretending not to listen and was watching her with obvious attention. "The purple heart symbol in the tattoo represents the medal Rex received posthumously," Sarah concluded. "He died saving the lives of 12 soldiers, including mine. The tattoo isn't just art. It's his memorial, his service record, and my promise that his sacrifice won't be forgotten." When she finished speaking, the silence stretched for several long moments. Then Master Chief Rodriguez raised his beer bottle in a quiet toast. "To Rex," he said simply. "To Rex," the group echoed, and Sarah felt tears threaten for the first time that evening. As the formal gathering began to wind down, Sarah noticed Commander Thompson approaching her table. She braced herself for another round of subtle questioning or dismissal, but his expression had changed completely. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your service that were completely unfair." Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the directness of his admission. "I looked up your unit's deployment records after hearing your story," Thompson continued. "The 173rd Airborne's dog handling teams had an exceptional record in Afghanistan, and your patrol's actions on that final mission were noted in several after-action reports. Rex's medal was well earned." The acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than she could express. To have her service recognized by a member of the elite special operations community felt like a validation she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a lot." Thompson nodded and started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, that tattoo is one of the most honorable memorials I've ever seen. Rex was lucky to have you as his partner." As Thompson rejoined his team across the room, Sarah felt something shift inside her. For the first time since coming home, she felt like she might actually belong in the community of warriors she had served alongside. The weeks following the reunion brought an unexpected flood of requests for Sarah's help. Word had spread through the veteran community about her success with retired military dogs, and her phone rang constantly with calls from handlers struggling to help their partners adjust to civilian life. Commander Morrison had become an unofficial coordinator, setting up a network of veterans who could refer cases to each other. Sarah found herself busier than ever, splitting her time between her regular job at the veterinary clinic and her growing work with military dogs and their handlers. Dr. Peterson had been incredibly supportive, even allowing her to use the clinic's facilities for some of her sessions with veterans. One particularly challenging case involved a Marine named Sergeant Collins, whose partner, a German Shepherd named King, had developed severe anxiety after their return from deployment. King had been an explosive detection dog in Iraq, and the transition to suburban life had left him constantly on edge. Collins was at his wit's end, watching his once confident partner struggle with panic attacks triggered by everyday sounds like car backfires or construction noise. "He saved my life more times than I can count," Collins told Sarah during their first session. "Now I can't even take him for a walk without him having a breakdown. The VA says maybe it's time to consider putting him down, but I can't give up on him." Sarah worked with King for weeks, using a combination of techniques she had developed through her own recovery and methods she had learned from other handlers. Slowly, King began to show improvement. The breakthrough came when Sarah introduced him to Bruno, the retired police dog she had been working with at the clinic. The two dogs seemed to understand each other in ways that transcended their different service backgrounds. "It's like they're speaking the same language," Collins observed one afternoon as he watched King play peacefully with Bruno for the first time in months. "He hasn't been this relaxed since we got back." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what Collins meant. Military dogs carried their own form of PTSD, and sometimes the best therapy came from connecting with others who had shared similar experiences. She began organizing group sessions, bringing together multiple dogs and handlers who could support each other through the recovery process. The success of these group sessions caught the attention of local media. A reporter from the city newspaper heard about Sarah's work and asked to do a feature story about veteran services in the community. Sarah was hesitant about the publicity, but Commander Morrison and others convinced her that sharing her story could help more veterans who didn't know such services existed. The interview took place at the veterinary clinic, with King and Bruno serving as examples of the progress that was possible with the right support. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, was respectful and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the challenges faced by returning veterans and their animals. "What made you decide to focus on this particular aspect of veteran care?" Walsh asked as she watched Sarah work with King. "Military dogs give everything they have to their handlers and their missions," Sarah explained, gently encouraging King to navigate a simple obstacle course designed to rebuild his confidence. "When they come home, they deserve the same level of commitment from us. Rex taught me that loyalty isn't just a one-way street." As Sarah spoke about Rex and showed the reporter her memorial tattoo, she felt the familiar mix of pride and pain that always accompanied sharing his story. Walsh listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about the bond between handlers and their dogs. "I've never really understood the military working dog program," Walsh admitted. "Are these animals just tools, or is there something more to the relationship?" Sarah paused in her work with King to consider the question. "They start as tools," she said finally. "But somewhere in the training and deployment process, they become partners. Rex wasn't just my dog, he was my backup, my early warning system, and my friend. In some situations, I trusted his judgment more than my own." The resulting newspaper article was better than Sarah had dared to hope. Walsh had captured not just the facts about her program, but the emotional depth of the relationships between handlers and their dogs. The piece ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, complete with photos of Sarah working with King and a detailed explanation of her tattoo's significance. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's phone began ringing before she'd even finished reading the article, with calls from veterans across the state asking for help. Local businesses offered to donate supplies and funding for her program. Most surprisingly, she received a call from the regional VA hospital asking if she would consider developing a formal partnership with their mental health services. "We've been looking for ways to improve our treatment, options for veterans with PTSD," explained Dr. Martinez, the VA's chief of psychiatry. "Your approach with the military dog seems to be filling a gap that traditional therapy hasn't been able to address." Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of expanding her informal program into something more official, but she was also nervous about the bureaucracy and oversight that would come with a government partnership. She arranged to meet with Dr. Martinez and his team to discuss the possibilities. The meeting took place at the VA hospital, a sprawling complex that Sarah had visited many times for her own treatment after returning from Afghanistan. Walking through the familiar hallways brought back memories of her own struggles with readjustment, reminding her of how lost she had felt in those first months home. Dr. Martinez turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had served as a Navy corpsman before going to medical school. His understanding of military culture was immediately apparent, and Sarah felt comfortable discussing her methods and philosophy with him. "What we're seeing," Dr. Martinez explained, "is that traditional talk therapy works well for some veterans, but others need something more concrete, more connected to their military experience. Your work with the dog seems to bridge that gap." Sarah outlined her techniques, explaining how working with the animals helped handlers process their own trauma while giving them a sense of purpose and mission. "It's not just about helping the dogs," she said. "It's about giving the handlers a way to use their military skills in a positive, healing environment." The VA team was enthusiastic about developing a pilot program that would integrate Sarah's methods with their existing services. They offered to provide funding, facilities, and professional support that would allow her to help far more veterans than she could reach on her own. As Sarah drove home from the meeting, she felt excited about the possibilities but also somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly her life was changing. What had started as an informal way to help a few struggling veterans was becoming something much larger and more significant. That evening, she called Commander Morrison to update him on the day's developments. His enthusiasm was infectious, and he immediately began discussing ways to expand the network of handlers who could participate in the program. "This could be exactly what a lot of us have been looking for," Morrison said. "A way to turn our military experience into something that helps others heal. Rex would be proud of what you're building in his memory." As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked at Rex's portrait on her arm and felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since their last patrol together. She was finally finding a way to honor his sacrifice while helping others who carried similar burdens. The program was officially launching in 6 weeks, and Sarah knew that everything was about to change again. But for the first time since coming home, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The VA partnership officially launched on a crisp Monday morning in October, exactly 1 month before the 4th anniversary of Rex's death. Sarah developed specific exercises designed to rebuild confidence in both the handlers and their dogs. One particularly effective technique involved setting up controlled scenarios that allowed the dogs to successfully detect hidden objects, reminding them of their skills and purpose. For the handlers, these successes served as powerful reminders of their partner's capabilities and their own abilities as leaders. The breakthrough came during the program's 6th week. Peterson and Ranger were working through a detection exercise when Ranger suddenly became alert to something Sarah hadn't planted. His body language indicated he had found something significant, and his training kicked in as he sat and stared at a specific spot near the building's foundation. "That's a real alert," Peterson said, his voice tight with concern. "Ranger's telling us there's something dangerous there." Sarah immediately called for the building to be evacuated while bomb disposal experts were contacted. It turned out that Ranger had detected a small gas leak that could have become dangerous if left unaddressed. The incident was a powerful reminder that these dogs retained their life-saving abilities even while struggling with trauma. The local media picked up the story, and suddenly Sarah found herself in the spotlight again. This time, however, the attention felt different. Instead of being seen as an oddity with unusual tattoos, she was being recognized as a professional who was making a real difference in the lives of veterans. Commander Thompson, the SEAL who had initially questioned her credentials at the reunion, surprised Sarah by showing up at the facility unannounced one afternoon. He brought with him another SEAL and a military working dog who had recently retired. "I wanted to see this program for myself," Thompson explained. "And I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you at that reunion. I've been hearing incredible things about what you're accomplishing here." Thompson's visit carried unexpected weight within the military community. SEALs were known for their high standards and their reluctance to endorse programs they hadn't thoroughly vetted. His public support of Sarah's work opened doors that had previously been closed. Within days of Thompson's visit, Sarah received calls from military units across the country, asking about expanding the program to other locations. The Department of Defense expressed interest in incorporating her methods into their official transition services for retiring military working dogs. "We're looking at something much bigger than any of us originally imagined," Dr. Martinez told Sarah during one of their weekly planning meetings. "The Joint Chiefs are talking about making this a model for military installations nationwide." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had never intended to become a national figure in veteran services. She had simply wanted to help a few struggling dogs and their handlers. Now she was being asked to develop curriculum, train other therapists, and potentially oversee programs across multiple states. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment looking at the growing pile of requests, proposals, and opportunities that had accumulated on her kitchen table. The tattoo on her arm seemed to catch the light differently as she moved, and she found herself thinking about Rex and how proud he would have been of what they had accomplished together. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Commander Morrison's number, and she answered expecting another update about the program's expansion. "Sarah, you need to turn on Channel 7 News right now," Morrison said without preamble. "There's something you need to see." Sarah grabbed her remote and switched to the local news station, where she was shocked to see footage of herself working with Peterson and Ranger at the VA facility. The reporter was discussing the success of the program and its potential for national expansion. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the coverage of her work, it was the man being interviewed as an expert on military working dogs. It was someone she recognized from her deployment days, a senior officer who had been critical of dog handling units and had questioned their effectiveness on multiple occasions. "While I'm sure Ms. Martinez means well," the officer was saying, "we need to be careful about programs that promise more than they can deliver. Military working dogs are valuable assets, but they're ultimately tools that serve a specific purpose. When that purpose is over, we need to be realistic about their ongoing value." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched the interview. The officer was subtly undermining everything she had worked to build, suggesting that her program was based on emotional attachment rather than practical results. Worse, he was doing it in front of a television audience that included many of the veterans she was trying to help. As the interview concluded, Sarah realized that her biggest challenge wasn't going to be expanding the program or managing its success. It was going to be defending it against people who didn't understand the true value of what she and Rex had shared, and what that bond could mean for other veterans struggling to find their way home. The phone rang again, and Sarah saw it was Dr. Martinez calling. She knew the conversation would be about damage control and public relations, but all she could think about was the veterans in her program who might be watching that interview and wondering if their own bonds with their partners were being dismissed as mere sentiment. "Don't let him get in your head." Morrison's voice came through the phone as she realized she had never hung up from his call. "Everyone who matters knows the truth about what you're doing. This is just politics and it'll blow over." Sarah hoped he was right, but she had a feeling that the real test of her program was just beginning. The success they had achieved so far had made them visible, and visibility brought scrutiny from people who had their own agendas about military policy and veteran services. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah looked at Rex's portrait one more time and made a silent promise. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would continue fighting for the recognition that military working dogs and their handlers deserved. Rex had given his life for that cause, and she would honor that sacrifice no matter what obstacles emerged. Arrived at the new facility, a converted warehouse space that had been transformed into a state-of-the-art training and therapy center. Feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation, the space was impressive. The VA had spared no expense in creating an environment that would serve both the dogs and their handlers. There were indoor and outdoor training areas, comfortable spaces for group therapy sessions, individual consultation rooms, and even a small veterinary clinic for basic health needs. Dr. Martinez met Sarah at the entrance, accompanied by a small team of VA staff members who would be supporting the program. "Ready for the grand tour?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite hide his own nervousness about the ambitious new venture. As they walked through the facility, Sarah was struck by how much thought had gone into every detail. The designers had consulted with experts in both animal behavior and veteran psychology to create spaces that would be calming for traumatized dogs while remaining functional for therapy work. "We've got our first group arriving this afternoon," Dr. Martinez explained as they entered the main training area. 12 veterans and their dogs, all referred through the regional VA system. They've been screened by our mental health team and are eager to get started. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Despite all her experience working with individual handlers and their dogs, leading a formal group program felt like an enormous responsibility. These veterans were counting on her to help them heal, and she wasn't entirely sure she was qualified for such an important task. The morning flew by as Sarah worked with the VA staff to finalize preparations. She reviewed case files for each of the participating veterans, noting their service histories, current challenges, and the specific issues their dogs were experiencing. The group was diverse: Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans who had served in conflicts from the Gulf War to recent operations in Syria. When the first participants began arriving that afternoon, Sarah was reminded of her own early days in therapy. The veterans moved with the careful control of people who had learned not to let their guard down, while their dogs displayed varying degrees of anxiety and hypervigilance. "Welcome to the program," Sarah said, as the group gathered in the main meeting area. I know this is new for all of us, and I want you to know that we're going to figure this out together. I'm not here as an expert who has all the answers. I'm here as someone who's walked a similar path and wants to help you and your partners find your way forward. She began by sharing her own story, including the struggles she had faced after returning from Afghanistan. As she spoke about Rex and the long journey toward healing, she watched the faces of the veterans in front of her. She saw recognition, understanding, and for the first time in many of their eyes, hope. The goal isn't to erase what you and your dogs have been through, Sarah continued. The goal is to help you both find ways to use your experiences and skills in positive ways, while learning to manage the challenges that come with them. The first session focused on assessment and relationship building. Sarah worked with each veteran dog pair individually, observing their interactions and identifying specific areas where intervention might be helpful. Some dogs were struggling with aggression, others with anxiety or depression. Some handlers were overprotective of their animals, while others seemed disconnected from them. One case that particularly caught Sarah's attention was a young Marine named Corporal Peterson and his partner, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger. Peterson had lost his left leg to an IED explosion during their final deployment, and Ranger had been present during the attack. Both were struggling with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. Ranger hasn't been the same since that day, Peterson explained during their individual session. He used to be so confident, so sure of himself. Now he jumps at every unexpected sound and won't leave my side. I think he blames himself for not detecting that IED. Sarah understood exactly what Peterson meant. Military dogs were trained to detect threats, and when something got past them, they often carried that failure in ways that were heartbreakingly similar to human guilt. Has anyone explained to you that the IED was probably designed specifically to defeat dog detection? She asked. Peterson shook his head, and Sarah spent the next hour explaining how insurgent bomb makers had adapted their techniques to counter military working dogs. The explosive device that had injured Peterson had likely been designed to be undetectable by conventional means. Ranger didn't fail, Sarah said firmly. He was defeated by technology that was specifically designed to counter his abilities. That's not failure. That's being outgunned by an enemy who had unlimited time to prepare. As the weeks progressed, the program began to show promising results. The group sessions became more interactive as veterans shared their experiences and learned from each other. The dogs began to relax in the controlled environment, responding positively to the structured activities in the presence of other military working dogs. Sarah. The criticism from the television interview created an unexpected firestorm that Sarah was completely unprepared to handle. Within hours of the broadcast, social media was buzzing with debates about military spending, veteran services, and the value of programs like hers. The VA's Public Affairs Office was fielding calls from reporters, politicians, and advocacy groups, all wanting to weigh in on the controversy. Dr. Martinez called an emergency meeting for the next morning, bringing together Sarah, the VA's regional director, and several department heads who were suddenly concerned about the political implications of supporting the program. The good news is that most of the feedback has been positive, the regional director, a man named Robert Chen, explained as he shuffled through a stack of printed emails and phone messages. Veterans organizations are rallying behind the program, and we've received dozens of calls from active duty personnel asking about similar services. What's the bad news? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Congressional oversight is asking questions, Chen replied grimly. Senator Williams sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and his office has requested a full briefing on the program's costs and effectiveness metrics. They want to know if taxpayer money is being spent appropriately. Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had dealt with military bureaucracy during her service, but political oversight was an entirely different beast. Politicians often made decisions based on optics and public perception, rather than actual results or veteran needs. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Dr. Martinez asked. They want a comprehensive report within 2 weeks, Chen said, including detailed case studies, cost analyses, and measurable outcomes. If we can't demonstrate clear value, the program could be suspended pending further review. The meeting continued for another hour, with various officials discussing strategy and damage control. Sarah found herself feeling increasingly disconnected from the conversation as bureaucrats debated the political implications of her work. These were the same kinds of discussions that had frustrated her during her military service. People in offices making decisions about programs they had never experienced firsthand. After the meeting, Sarah drove back to the facility feeling discouraged and angry. She had never wanted to become involved in politics or public policy debates. She had simply wanted to help veterans and their dogs heal from trauma. Now she was being forced to defend that work to people who viewed it through the lens of budget lines and political advantage. At the facility, she found Peterson working with Ranger in one of the training areas. The young Marine had made remarkable progress over the past weeks, and Ranger was showing signs of his old confidence returning. Watching them work together reminded Sarah of why she had started this program in the first place. "How are you holding up?" Peterson asked when he noticed Sarah watching from the doorway. "I saw that interview last night. What a load of garbage." Sarah was surprised by the vehemence in Peterson's voice. "You don't have to defend the program on my account," she said. "I know this political stuff can be complicated." "Complicated?" Peterson's expression hardened. That guy has probably never spent a day outside the wire with a military working dog. He has no idea what Ranger and I went through together, or what this program has meant for both of us. As if sensing the tension in his handler's voice, Ranger moved closer to Peterson and sat at attention, his eyes focused and alert. The simple gesture demonstrated the bond between them more clearly than any research study or government report ever could. "You know what I think about when I watch Ranger work now?" Peterson continued. "I think about how we're a team again. For months after we got back, I felt like I had failed him by getting hurt, and he was acting like he had failed me by not detecting that IED. This program helped us both understand that we're stronger together than we are carrying guilt separately." Peterson's words struck Sarah deeply. This was exactly the kind of outcome that couldn't be easily quantified in a government report, but it represented the true value of what they were accomplishing. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into documenting the program's results. She compiled detailed case studies, tracked measurable improvements in both dogs and handlers, and calculated cost comparisons with traditional therapy approaches. The work was tedious and frustrating, but she knew it was necessary to protect the program. Commander Morrison and several other veterans volunteered to help with the documentation process. They organized testimonials from program participants, gathered support letters from military units that had worked with Sarah's graduates, and even created a video presentation showcasing the dog's improved capabilities. "We're not just fighting for your program," Morrison explained as they worked late one evening in the facility's conference room. "We're fighting for recognition that military working dogs and their handlers deserve the same level of support as any other veteran. This is bigger than any individual case." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Commander Thompson, the SEAL who had become one of Sarah's most vocal supporters, called with news that could change everything. "I've been making some calls through special operations channels," Thompson said. "It turns out that several classified after-action reports from recent deployments specifically mention the life-saving actions of military working dog teams. I can't share the details, but I can tell you that senior Pentagon officials are very interested in programs that help maintain those capabilities in retired dogs." Thompson had arranged for Sarah to brief a group of high-ranking military officials who were visiting the region for a defense contractors conference. These officers had direct experience with military working dogs in combat situations and understood their value in ways that politicians and bureaucrats might not. The briefing took place in a secure conference room at the nearby military base. Sarah found herself facing a panel of colonels, generals, and senior enlisted leaders who represented every branch of the armed forces. The setting was intimidating, but Sarah felt more comfortable addressing military personnel than she had dealing with political officials. "The question isn't whether military working dogs have value," Sarah began her presentation. "The question is whether we're going to honor the commitment we made to them when they enlisted in our service." She walked the panel through the program's methods and results, but she focused primarily on the operational capabilities that retired military dogs retained when properly supported. Ranger's detection of the gas leak became a key example of how trauma therapy could actually enhance rather than diminish these animals' abilities. "What we're seeing," Sarah explained, "is that dogs who receive appropriate transition support maintain their training and instincts while becoming more stable and reliable partners. This isn't just about helping veterans feel better. It's about preserving national security assets that took years and significant resources to develop. The questions from the panel were sharp and professional, focusing on practical applications and measurable outcomes rather than political implications. These officers understood the true value of military working dogs because they had seen them in action. At the end of the session, a Marine general who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing stood up and addressed Sarah directly. "Mrs. Martinez, I've read the after-action reports from your deployment in Afghanistan. Rex's actions on that final patrol saved more than just your unit. Intelligence gathered from that operation prevented a major attack on coalition forces." The general paused, and Sarah felt the room's attention focus completely on his next words. "What you're doing with this program honors that sacrifice and ensures that other dogs like Rex can continue serving their country even after they retire from active duty. You have the full support of this command." As Sarah left the briefing, she felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. Military endorsement carried significant weight in Washington, and having senior officers on record supporting the program would make it much harder for politicians to dismiss it as wasteful spending. But she also knew that the real test was still coming. In 1 week, she would face the congressional committee that would ultimately decide the program's fate. Everything she had worked to build would depend on her ability to convince a room full of politicians that the bond between handlers and their dogs was worth preserving and supporting. The night before the hearing, Sarah sat in her apartment looking at Rex's portrait on her arm and preparing for the most important presentation of her life. Tomorrow, she would have one chance to speak for every military working dog and handler who had ever served their country with honor. She intended to make sure their voices were heard. The congressional hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a gray Wednesday morning in Washington. D.C. Sarah had arrived the night before, staying in a modest hotel near Capitol Hill and spending hours rehearsing her testimony. She had been advised by the VA's legal team to keep her presentation formal and fact-based. But Sarah knew that facts alone wouldn't capture the true significance of what military working dogs meant to their handlers. The hearing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, but the formal atmosphere was intimidating nonetheless. Senator Williams, the committee chairman who had requested the review, sat at the center of the panel with 4 other senators flanking him on either side. Behind Sarah, the gallery was filled with reporters, VA officials, and a surprising number of veterans who had traveled to D.C. to show their support. As Sarah took her seat at the witness table, she noticed Commander Thompson and Master Chief Rodriguez sitting in the front row of the gallery. Morrison was there too, along with Peterson, who had brought Ranger as a demonstration of the program's success. The sight of familiar faces helped calm Sarah's nerves as the hearing was called to order. Senator Williams opened with a statement that made his skepticism clear. "We're here today to examine a program that, while well-intentioned, may represent an inefficient use of taxpayer resources. In an era of budget constraints, we must ensure that every dollar spent on veteran services delivers maximum value." Sarah listened as Williams outlined his concerns about the program's costs and questioned whether therapy for military animals was an appropriate use of government funds. His tone was respectful but dismissive, treating the entire concept as an emotional indulgence rather than a legitimate medical intervention. When Sarah was called to present her testimony, she stood and faced the panel with the same composure she had shown during military briefings in Afghanistan. She had decided to ignore the legal team's advice about keeping things formal. This was too important for bureaucratic language. "Senators, my name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm a combat veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan with my partner, Rex, a military working dog who gave his life in service to our country. I'm here today not just to defend a program, but to speak for thousands of veterans whose voices aren't often heard in rooms like this." She gestured toward her arm, where Rex's portrait was clearly visible beneath her professional blazer. "This tattoo represents a promise I made to honor Rex's sacrifice by ensuring that other military working dogs and their handlers receive the support they've earned through their service." Sarah walked the committee through the program's results, but she focused on the stories rather than the statistics. She talked about Peterson and Ranger, about Collins and King, about Commander Morrison and Ace. She described how each pair had struggled with invisible wounds that traditional therapy couldn't address, and how working together had helped them heal. "These aren't pets receiving luxury spa treatments," Sarah said. her voice growing stronger as she spoke. These are combat veterans, both human and canine, who continue to serve their communities even after their military careers have ended. Ranger detected a dangerous gas leak that could have caused serious injuries. King now works with local police departments to detect explosives at public events. Ace helps train new military working dogs at the regional training facility. Senator Williams interrupted with a question about cost-effectiveness, but Sarah was ready for him. Senator, the average cost to train a military working dog from puppy to deployment readiness is approximately $150,000. Many of these dogs retire with years of useful life remaining. Our program helps ensure that investment continues to pay dividends for their communities. The questions continued for nearly an hour, with some senators showing genuine interest in the program, while others remained skeptical. Sarah answered each inquiry with facts and examples, but she could sense that the committee wasn't entirely convinced. Then something unexpected happened. Senator Carol Martinez, no relation to Sarah, a Democrat from California who had remained mostly silent during the hearing, asked a question that changed the entire tone of the room. Ms. Martinez, I notice that your tattoo includes what appears to be a purple heart symbol. Can you explain the significance of that? Sarah felt her throat tighten slightly, but she maintained her composure. Rex received the Purple Heart posthumously for wounds received in action while saving the lives of 12 soldiers, including myself. He's one of only a handful of military animals to receive that honor. And how did Rex earn that medal? Senator Martinez pressed gently. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell Rex's story in detail for the first time during the hearing. She described their final patrol, the complex ambush, and Rex's decision to stay and fight despite being wounded. She talked about the intelligence gathered from that operation and how it had prevented future attacks on coalition forces. As she spoke, the room grew completely silent. Even Senator Williams stopped shuffling through his papers and listened intently to her account of that night in Afghanistan. Rex could have retreated to safety, Sarah concluded, but he understood that his job was to protect the soldiers in his unit, and he did that job until his last breath. The dogs in our program carry that same sense of duty and loyalty. They've earned the right to comprehensive care, not just during their active service, but throughout their lives. When Sarah finished speaking, the silence stretched for several long moments. Then Senator Martinez spoke again, her voice softer than it had been earlier. Ms. Martinez, I want to thank you for your service and for Rex's sacrifice. I think this committee needs to understand that we're not just talking about a therapy program, we're talking about honoring commitments made to those who have served our country with distinction. The tide of the hearing shifted noticeably after that exchange. Other senators began asking more supportive questions, and even Senator Williams seemed to reconsider his position. When the formal testimony concluded, Williams called for a brief recess before the committee's deliberation. During the break, Sarah was approached by several people from the gallery, including veterans who wanted to thank her for speaking on behalf of military working dogs. But the most meaningful moment came when Commander Thompson approached her with someone she hadn't noticed in the crowd. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Admiral Richardson, who oversees special operations training for the Navy. He flew in specifically for this hearing. The Admiral, a distinguished man in his 60s, shook Sarah's hand with obvious respect. Miss Martinez, that was one of the most compelling testimonies I've heard in 30 years of military service. Rex would be proud. When the hearing reconvened, Senator Williams announced the committee's decision. After careful consideration of the testimony and evidence presented today, this committee recommends not only the continuation of the current program, but its expansion to additional VA facilities nationwide. The courage and sacrifice demonstrated by military working dogs like Rex deserve our continued support and recognition. The gallery erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time that day. She had not only saved the program, she had secured its future expansion to help thousands more veterans across the country. As Sarah left the Capitol building that afternoon, she was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, but her attention was focused on Peterson and Ranger, who were waiting by the steps. The young Marine was grinning broadly while Ranger sat at perfect attention, his tail wagging slightly as he watched the crowd. We did it, Peterson said as Sarah approached. Rex's story got through to them. Sarah knelt down to scratch behind Ranger's ears. thinking about how proud Rex would have been to see this moment. The tattoo on her arm seemed to catch the afternoon sunlight, and for just a moment she could almost feel Rex's presence beside her. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a new class of veterans at the expanded facility, looking out at faces filled with the same hope and skepticism she had seen in her first group. Behind her, a large memorial wall displayed photos of military working dogs who had served with distinction, with Rex's portrait holding the place of honor at the center. "Welcome to the program," Sarah began, using the same words she had spoken to that first group so many months ago. "I'm not here as an expert who has all the answers. I'm here as someone who's walked a similar path and wants to help you and your partners find your way forward." As she began to share Rex's story once again, Sarah touched the tattoo on her arm and silently thanked him for continuing to serve even now. The laughter and judgment she had faced because of her memorial tattoo had led to this moment, a moment when the sacrifice of military working dogs was finally being recognized and honored at the highest levels of government. Rex's legacy lived on, not just in the ink on Sarah's skin, but in every veteran and dog who found healing through the program he had inspired. And in a world that often forgot the true cost of freedom, that was exactly the kind of memorial a hero like Rex deserved.